to the CTO's Caribbean Tourism Organization's webinar series. We're just going to give a few minutes for everyone else to join, and then we'll get the series kicked off with an introduction on the speakers and the moderator, and then we'll start the presentation today. So bear with us for a minute, and we'll be with you. First of all, I'd like to thank everybody for joining today. And definitely thank you to our panelists and the moderator today, Seleni, for joining the Allied Board Members webinar series. This is the third in our series of webinars that we've been doing. And today we're really happy to announce that we're going to have Seleni Matus moderate a session and have a dynamic conversation, which is going to explore how Caribbean destinations are addressing climate impacts and what initiatives in tourism in the tourism climate adaptive plans are being taken place or how they're being handled. First of all, I'd like to take the opportunity to introduce your moderator, Seleni Matus. She's an executive of the International Institute of Tourism Studies, as well as being an adjunct professor at George Washington University. She has over 20 years experience in designing and directing large-scale multi-stakeholder initiatives, such as the Mesoamerican Reef Tourism Initiative, as well as the Sustainable Destination Alliance of the Americas. In addition to that, as a native of Belize, Seleni also served as the country's director of tourism and oversaw the reorganization of Belize's tourism board to help them meet the fierce demands of today's marketplace. Seleni has also been in close collaboration over her 20-year career with over 30 tourism destinations throughout the United States, the Caribbean, and Latin America, and developing and implementing sustainable management plans with regards to long-term health and natural ecosystem. So I'm going to pass you over to Seleni so she can introduce you to the rest of the panelists and start this exciting conversation that is definitely at the right time and the right place.
Thank you so much, Casey, for that opening. Thanks to you and other board members, and also to the CTO for the opportunity to have this important discussion this morning that, as Casey mentioned, and that you all know, is focused on climate resilience. I think this is the third in the series, as Casey mentioned, these webinars that the CTO is providing. So we're very honored to be a part of the discussions with destinations and with partners of destinations throughout the Caribbean. Today we're going to be focusing on climate resilience, and we know that increasingly there is this focus on the changes that our destinations are already experiencing as a result of climate. And so today we're going to be looking at two case studies. In particular, we're going to be looking at the case study of St. Kitts and then also Jamaica in regards to the tremendous work that they have that leads us to better understand how Caribbean nations, increasingly referred to as large ocean states, so LOSs now instead of SIDs, how they are meeting this challenge posed by climate. We know that this region is one that is most vulnerable to the impacts we see and have been experiencing rising sea levels. We have been seeing in the news, and many of our communities have been impacted by the more frequent and intense hurricanes. And for all of us from the Caribbean who, have followed very closely what's happening in the water, we know that there are many more incidents of coral bleaching occurring on an annual basis. And all this is threatening, of course, the environment, on which the economic lifeblood of this region is based. We know that the Caribbean is the most tourism-dependent region in the world. A high portion or a significant portion of GDP in many of our Caribbean countries are tied to tourism. So it's absolutely critical that we within this industry start to think about, even go further than thinking about, like demonstrate actions toward addressing these climate risks. I think, there are very clear projections. Many countries have invested in understanding what climate impacts might look like in the future. Overall, we know there is evidence that within the Greater Caribbean, it is projected, or sea level rise is projected to rise by up to 1 meter by 2100. And we know that this will be devastating to much of the critical infrastructure for communities and tourism, such as airports, hotels, and the beaches that are drawing visitors to these nations. So we are facing, the damages already, and we just heard and saw the tremendous damage that Beryl left. This was the earliest Category 5 Atlantic hurricane in about 100 years to come through the Caribbean. But we've also had past experiences like Irma and Dorian, which really sort of bring into light and have helped us to understand what the economic impacts from these storms are. So beyond these threats, we know that there is degradation to the coral reef, there's beach erosion, I mentioned coral bleaching already, there's increased water scarcity. So all important to the tourism industry. And I want to say too, while this is focused on tourism industry, all these impacts are affecting our communities most importantly. And so I want to be sure to not leave that out, right? So, but our Caribbean nations aren't standing still. And as I mentioned, we're going to zoom in today to look at what St. Kitts and Jamaica are doing to sort of address climate mitigation as well as adaptation. So the St. Kitts case study will be looking at some mitigation as well as adaptation, and Jamaica's efforts mostly on adaptation. Not that they don't have mitigation focused actions, but the case studies that we're going to be providing in particular will be looking at adaptation. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome the three experts that we've brought to you to sort of have a deep conversation with here on the efforts that are being undertaken by St. Kitts and Jamaica. I would love to welcome here Dianil Taylor-Williams. Dianil is the director of the St. Kitts Ministry of Tourism, who has been so steeped in sustainability, a leader in St. Kitts for sustainable tourism development for more than a decade. So we are delighted to have Dianil here as a leader, sort of speaking about the efforts that St. Kitts is taking. I would also like to welcome Paloma Zapata, who is the Chief Executive Officer of the Sustainable Travel International, which is a global nonprofit. Many of you might know Sustainable Travel International, very involved in a wide range of issues, including work in assisting destinations to look at climate issues as well as more sustainable development in general. Also a partner to St. Kitts. So Paloma and Dianil will be taking us into or helping us to look under the hood at what has occurred there. Last but not least, we have Elecia Myers. Elecia Myers hails from Jamaica, of course. She is with the University of the West Indies, Mona campus, in Kingston, and represents the climate studies group here as project coordinator for the various efforts that have been undertaken focused on tourism and climate. So Elecia will be telling us more about the details. GW worked very closely with UWI on these projects, and it was just tremendous to have that opportunity to work as two academic institutions in looking at some latest thinking and bringing in strategies that may be new as well. In addition to working at UWI, Elecia has served and serves as a tourism policy specialist. She served within the Ministry of Tourism as a senior director of planning, and so brings all that rich experience to this conversation. So without further ado, ladies, I think we're ready, right? We're ready to go. So let's get into this then. So I would like to maybe pose the first question to Danielle, looking at the St. Kitts case study. So tell us a little bit. I mean, in this case, the Ministry of Tourism took a decision to demonstrate action around climate. And this was mainly focused or as a result of your commitment to the Glasgow Declaration, right? So Danielle, tell us a little bit maybe about what the Glasgow Declaration is. Why is it that St. Kitts decided to sort of take this step? And give us a sense of what is the kind of driving force behind your decision to take this leap and look at climate more seriously.
Okay, thank you, Seleni. So the Glasgow Declaration would be a commitment by tourism stakeholders globally to accelerate our action with respect to what is happening with the climate and particularly in the tourism industry. So we are committing to reducing our carbon emissions, supporting climate resilience, and these are aligned with the global climate goals. Now, in St. Kitts, we just signed on to the Glasgow Declaration in May of this year. And a part of our commitment as signatories, we are obligated to prepare a climate action plan. So it's not just talk. You have to have actions to support signing this pledge to reduce our carbon emissions and to be more climate resilient. Now, even before we signed the declaration, we had actually started working with assistance from Sustainable Travel International on our tourism climate action plan. And the main things we looked at was the fact that we, as you would have indicated in your opening, as a small destination, and we are actually the smallest state. St. Kitts and Nevis, our country, smallest in the Western Hemisphere, the smallest country. Now, the Glasgow Declaration, and I might point out, was signed by St. Kitts as a destination, not the entire country. But this is in keeping with the work we've been doing since 2012, having undertaken the destination study through GSTC. So we are continuing the work that began since 2012. And this was a natural next step in terms of recognizing the emergency and the contribution of tourism to greenhouse gas emissions. And so we started working on our climate action plan. And what we've done is we've worked on it with the support of the private sector and the public sector. We did workshops with the private sector and we did with the public sector to derive this. The fact that tourism is the main economic factor in our country makes it urgent for us to take action with respect to our managing the climate resilience of our destination. We know the impacts of climate change on the destination, as you would have mentioned as well, in terms of the intensity, the frequency of storms and other other weather activities. And we also have commitments. We've signed the Paris Agreement just 1 year or two ago. We would have had to publish our nationally determined contributions, and we made certain commitments there. So this is all in keeping with that. In addition, the government has determined that we are going to develop as a sustainable island state. And this is an action that is to be done by 2040. So all that we are doing with our signing the Glasgow Declaration, our commitments under the Paris Agreement, and the development of this climate action plan, all are working together towards us becoming a more sustainable island state.
It's wonderful. So there is sort of greater efforts, right, outside this, the specific project to develop this action plan that supports sustainable development and this focus on enhancing resilience of the nation. Yeah, thank you for that.
Yes.
Paloma, let's talk a little bit about the approach and methodology that, STI used in collaborating with St. Kitts Ministry of Tourism to develop this climate resilience strategy. Tell us more about what was the overall approach? What was the methodology? We want to understand the specifics here. Yeah.
Absolutely. So the main inputs to this approach is, of course, you start, with desktop research, understanding what the NDCs, what the different planning tools, the policies, the different investments, as well as planned investments are in the sector that, tourism is across the board. So we look at, all these different planning, tools that are already in place to try to understand the starting point. And of course, what are the different investments that are being planned for the destination. Secondly, which is something that Diane discussed, is actually the participatory planning. But even before the participatory planning, we did a lot of interviews as well to try to understand what are those, key pinch points when you're talking about, mitigating the carbon emissions, as well as, a regeneration of spaces and mitigating, climate change. So we did a lot of, a one-on-one interviews, but the participatory planning tool is one of the most important tools in this plan to really understand what the private sector, what the civil society and the public sector, what are they working on? What are they uncovering as far as what their needs are? So these workshops were really important in order to gain valuable insight and also to see the collaboration that you see already starting amongst them, because they're all working on something. And then when they see it all come together, it really starts making sense, for them. So that's a really important tool. Another important tool or approach is the carbon measurement, the destination level carbon measurement. And the approach that we use is the life cycle assessment approach. So what this means is we calculate the environmental impact, in this case, the carbon footprint of calculating by product and services of the tourism value chain by market segment. So meaning, how does the overnight tourism behave? What kind of products do they consume? And what's the carbon intensity of those products and services and how long they stay in the destination, as well as by markets, in the cruise tourism, as well as the yachters tourism, and even day trippers. So that's a really important sort of baseline that we need to set as far as, okay, what is the carbon intensity of the tourism industry? And of course, then the final product that we delivered is the climate action plan that is aligned with the Glasgow Declaration. So this action plan is aligned with the 5 pathways of the Glasgow Declaration, which is measurement, decarbonize, regenerate, collaborate, and finance. So we give a status of each one of these areas, and then of course an implementable action plan to really be able to demonstrate that, what the targets are and what the island wants to accomplish. And so with this, tool, this planning tool they have, then they can also then sign the Glasgow Declaration and be aligned with this a global initiative.
Thank you for that. That is very detailed and gives us a sense. I know there may be questions, especially from the audience. So audience, if you have questions, please write those down. We want to hear from you. There may be questions, especially about the carbon measurement and how this is done by sectors. So if you have any of those questions, please write them down. We'll look forward to discussing those details further. So Elecia, sort of shifting gears a little bit now to Jamaica. Yeah. Jamaica sort of took a decision to first understand what the sort of real impacts are, looking at it from a historical standpoint, but also projecting into the future. Yeah. And then it decided to do a more detailed vulnerability sort of risk assessment. So assessing what those climate risks are, and then eventually developed a climate adaptation action plan for the tourism sector, right? So that's like a big body of work that that UWE and the Climate Studies Group has sort of spearheaded in partnership with GW. So could you sort of share a little bit with us what the main findings of that sort of first piece of work that that was done was to understand sort of like the real impacts and what was occurring, right? So can you explain some of the main findings from the 2019 State of Jamaica Climate Report, which I guess for the first time had a tourism sector analysis, right? Or looked at this from a sectorial standpoint, with tourism being one of those sectors. Tell us more about that body of work and the main findings.
Okay, thank you, Seleni. And just saying congrats to the St. Kitts team for the work that they have taken on and the signing of that agreement. So for the first time, as Seleni said, in 2019, the Climate Studies Group, as part of the preparation of the State of the Jamaican Climate Report, we had done it 2 years prior. But for 2019, we wanted to look at the impact of climate on sectors and what's the status of those sectors. And part of the discussions looked at what are some indicators that we could arrive at that sectors could use to guide and monitor, how climate is impacting, how it's doing. So, we're happy to be a part of that. Just quickly, the Climate Studies Group, MONA, focuses on climate and the impact of oceans and weather and so on. And they look at historical data, and they also look at future data, so they can give guidance on what's going to happen and how we can prepare. So in trying to drill down on indicators that we could use as a sector, certainly we wanted to look at indicators that can be measured readily, data that can be found easily from either national or sector specifically. So that had to be an important criteria before we delved into it. And also we needed to kind of look at locations in our analysis that had the full range of tourism assets, the ones that had accommodations, attractions, had a beach, and so on. So that was a key starting point. The time frame for the work that we had to do was kind of very limited. And so we certainly didn't have 18 months to do any in-depth research. When you're looking at natural areas, you have to do it over like an 18-month time frame. But thankfully, we had data that was done previously. So the indicators that we looked at included coral cover. How will coral cover change with climate? Coral bleaching, coastal erosion, linked both to the reduction in coral cover and sea level rise, and also a major index, which we're calling the Holiday Climate Index. And the Holiday Climate Index looks at, the climatic suitability of a beach destination. Your guest is going to be thinking twice. Am I going to go to the region that's hot? And given the context we're in now, it might even be warmer. Will I be traveling there? The thermal comfort. So we looked at those 4 measures: thermal comfort, or the Holiday Climate Index, coral cover, coral bleaching, and coastal erosion. So the findings, so let me start with the Holiday Climate Index. That was actual data that the Climate Studies Group got. We had to partner with the Met Office, so we needed the weather data. And so we did some projections. We looked at what the climate index would have been in the past and what it will be in the future. What it showed us is that, Jamaica remained in the good to very good bracket. That was in 2019, 2020. There was a range of categories, and the good to very good. There's a better category, of course, which was excellent to ideal. You had marginal to acceptable, unfavorable, and impossible or dangerous. So the good to very good is not a bad place to be. But to be honest, I'm wondering, given the great changes and shifts that we've seen in 2023 in the temperature, I'm wondering what that would look like now if we were to run it again. But so what that showed us, that we're at a fairly good place, but there was a decline, trending towards a decline, and so that would be concerning. So somebody who's looking at this index to determine where to go to, we could be running into challenges in the Caribbean. And then regarding coral cover, I'm sorry, the news isn't more positive. Of course, the studies that we looked at showed a decline between 2000 and 2017 in our coral cover. The studies regarding coral bleaching show that there were increased incidents of coral bleaching between 1970 to 2010, and coastal erosion linked to the loss of coral cover and sea level rise. There was an increase in beach loss by over 50%. That was expected to happen over a 10-year period. So we were able to kind of set up these as indicators that we could suggest to the sector to use to guide them going forward, to track and monitor. So I hope that kind of helps. That's what we did. There are some tools that we applied. Maybe other countries can do the same. We don't know. And the climate studies group was happy to do the historical analysis and look at what's going to happen in the future to guide the process.
So I guess this really speaks to the importance of partnerships with local universities and other institutions that may have the data, to be able to provide that sort of look back into historical trends, and then based on that, the projections that are needed. But this, this HCI index, I think, is an important one. I'd just like to, before we move on to the next question, emphasize the utility of this index in giving destinations a really good insight into not just the impacts of tourism, but what the impacts of climate, but most importantly, what the impacts of climate might have on the demand for tourism. So this index really sort of looks at that other side as well, and considers variables that would provide insights into how the changes in climate may affect the appeal of your destination to visitors. So that's a great index to zoom in on. So let's go back to St. Kitts. And Daniel, this, of course, you mentioned actually in your first response that you've been working, that this project focused on climate resilience is really sort of the culmination or builds upon a lot of previous work that, has been ongoing under sort of your leadership from 2012. So give us a sense. We really want to understand how you're seeing the strategies that have been produced, this action plan that now exists. How do you see that sort of tying in to your sustainability efforts, and most importantly, your competitiveness as a destination? And can you sort of help us to understand what you see the benefits of this project being to the community and economy more broadly?
Thank you so much for that question. Now, I believe that by us integrating these strategies into our sector, we are taking a very crucial step to ensure the long-term sustainability and the competitiveness that you would have mentioned of the industry. It would help to safeguard our tourism assets because, as you know, our assets, the built environment and the natural environment play a big part in tourism. As a matter of fact, when I was considering this, I remembered when I saw the theme of this panel discussion, I remembered some years ago when we were celebrating Tourism Month, we had a theme which was Know the Environment, No Tourism, which was the knowledge. But the other side of it was no environment, no tourism, right? And that is what the point we are at. If we don't have these things, there is no tourism. And then we look at it, if there's no tourism, what becomes of our economy? What becomes of our people, right? And so it makes sense that we safeguard the assets that we do have. We create opportunities. It would afford us the opportunity to create new opportunities through taking these actions that are in the climate action plan, because we can have new niche markets being created. We often boast in St. Kitts of the fact that our rainforest is one of the few that continues to grow. And so it affords us opportunities in terms of ecotourism, right? And then with the growing demand, because we know it, we've seen the studies where visitors, travelers are now demanding destinations that prioritize sustainability. And so it would behoove us to take the necessary actions if we want to be appealing to the visitors, potential visitors or repeat visitors to our destination. We were doing a lot to position ourselves as responsible and forward thinking as a destination, and thereby we would be more competitive. Now, it also helps in terms of the community in the sense of job creation and job security. As was mentioned by my fellow panelists, when you start to look at the indexes and the places where people would travel in terms of weather, the climate, now it means that there will be less demand for your destination if there are circumstances that do not appeal to the visitors. It's warm, and it's warm where they are and it's warm where we are, then why should I travel? So we are looking at taking action because we are looking at the long term, ensuring the job security of the people who are already in the sector, right? And we are also looking at empowering our communities to take action. Now, one of the hardest things is to change attitudes. We've always done it this way. You can change knowledge, you can change skills, but in terms of changing attitudes, the Climate Action Plan affords us the opportunity to do more education and awareness within our communities to bring everyone on board with what we are doing in terms of the strategies for our resilience as a destination, right? And the foreign exchange that we stand to gain cannot be understated if we take all these actions. And as Paloma would have mentioned, it is not all being led by the Ministry of Tourism. We are capitalizing on actions that are already being undertaken by persons, other ministries, even the private sector. When we think about it, the actions that they're taking, how can we pool all of these things together to ensure the sustainability of our tourism product vis-a-vis our island state? And I think that is why it's so crucial for us to take these steps.
I love what you said about, this effort really providing sort of that opportunity to like take stock and understand what others are doing and bringing people together, right? So you're not necessarily starting from scratch, not necessarily, but building upon what exists there and ensuring that this is long term, right? This is not short term, as you're saying. Changing attitudes and practices takes time, and that's the investment needed. So Paloma, I'm sure there were some key takeaways and lessons learned from the St. Kitts experience. We have a big audience here. I wonder if you could share what you would think would be sort of those high-level insights about, what was learned that you think would be useful for destinations as they think about their climate resilience strategies.
Sure. So, I mean, for me, it's like there's, three top lessons learned. And the first one is, data collection. In order for us to be able to have a complete carbon footprint measurement that is as accurate as possible, we need data. And there's a lot of lack of data. And they could be considered across the board in the Caribbean. So that's one issue that still needs to be solved, is like proper data collection. So we need better mechanisms for data collection. One particular market that is across the Caribbean is, for example, the yachters markets. So the boaters and the yachters, to really understand their patterns within the islands, and to really try to measure what is that actual carbon footprint. We need to understand a lot more, how they function. So I think the data collection is one of the big lessons learned here if we want to have that, really thorough baseline. Secondly, is that collaboration approach. I think it's super important that in any climate action plan that you take the collaboration approach, you facilitate collaboration. And again, we keep, Dianil mentioned it again, that aha moment, you have those people collaborating and understanding what they're doing, in how it all aligns and all towards that bigger picture. So I think it's really important to really be able to facilitate that. And then thirdly is finance mechanisms. It is doing the research, you really identify there's a lot of funding sources out there. So during this approach, we were able to really identify those. So a lot of programs might get, not flourish, not get where they need to go, because maybe there's a lack of knowledge that the funding mechanisms do actually exist. So this approach really uncovers that. What are those opportunities in the public, in the international community, in the private sector, all of those funding mechanisms. So those are the 3 lessons learned that I think are really important for other islands and other destinations to really take into account.
Well, this is fantastic and hopefully very, very hopeful for other destinations in knowing that with the right partners and with a collaborative approach, you can access that funding needed to go through these processes in your nation. Yeah. So Elecia, shifting back to Jamaica here. You spoke about the State of Jamaica's Climate Report 2019, those indicators that, were proposed as a framework for monitoring the impacts of tourism over time in coastal destinations. You took a focus, I don't think you mentioned this, on Montego Bay in particular, and had some interesting findings there, right? So tell us a little bit more about then what followed up next, which is that vulnerability risk assessment. And that was the basis upon which the action plan was developed. So share with the audience what that vulnerability risk assessment is about. Why did you have that? Like, what's the scope of it? What did you learn from it?
Okay, so we were approached by the Ministry of Economic Growth and Job Creation in Jamaica to support the development of vulnerability risk assessments and climate change adaptation plans for 5 sectors. I'm only going to focus on tourism. They suggested that we use a CAPRA methodology, CAPRA meaning comprehensive approach for probabilistic risk assessment. A tongue-tying word, but we tried to stay as close as possible to this methodology. And it involved, 1, looking at what are the hazards to the sector, what are the likely hazards the sector will face, what are the assets that will be at risk, and look at the economic implications of those hazards, and then an assessment of the adaptive capacity of the sector to deal with the challenges that would be inevitable. So, we focus on assets such as hotels, attractions, airports, cruise ports in our analysis. And the hazards that we honed in on for that study was storm surge, sea level rise, coastal erosion, flooding, and temperature. And then again, we looked at the economic implications of these hazards on the sector, and at the end of the process, we also then looked at what is the capacity of the sector to deal with these challenges? Does the sector have a risk management plan, a climate change adaptation plan? Does it have financing? What is in place to make this work? So those were parts of what the process included. So very quickly, in terms of outcomes from the risk assessment, very high level outcome, we looked at 322 hotels, I think, across the country, mostly the larger properties, and it showed that 44% of these hotels, 143 of 322, are within at least one of the hazards. And that for us, Negril was the most vulnerable, then Montego Bay, then Ocho Rios in terms of to hazards. So these studies are important in your understanding your destination, that there might be differences across your destination areas. In Jamaica, we have 7 destination areas. And of course, it showed up that Negril was one of the most vulnerable. So that was kind of the hazard assessment. And so having done the hazard assessment now, we then said, okay, our climate change adaptation plans need to take these things into account. If it means that our tourism sector is going to suffer from increased infrastructure damage and those associated costs, less arrivals because of hurricanes, and the other implications, significant economic implications were tallied as a part of that process. But it then meant that the plan had to then take account of certain things. And at a very high level, some of these things included developing tourism strategies that take into account the risks and ensure long-term destination productivity and competitiveness. That's just a very high level. There are other examples. Strengthening the enabling environment for the development of the climate resilient sector. That's a big piece. And development of vulnerability risk assessments and adaptation plans for all destination areas. So we kind of did it for the country as a whole, but as I said, each destination area has their own idiosyncrasies. And so that's something we saw as a critical next step. And in addition, to get drill down to kind of climate smart practices now, certainly the need to mainstream climate risk management in licensing requirements for our tourism businesses, so that, we're protecting them, even if they haven't seen the value of protecting themselves. Establishing a voluntary sustainability and resilience standard for tourism businesses as well. That's something that came out as a recommendation, and certainly fostering improved disaster risk management and widespread adoption of the vulnerability and sustainability resilience standard. So once you have the standard in place, how to ensure that the businesses take it on and implement fully. So those are some of the outcomes at a quick snapshot at a high level. And GW was integral to the process, Seleni. So I don't know if you think there are any major pieces that need to be shared, but certainly it was very useful. And we had done it for other sectors in parallel too. So we did health, we did agriculture, and then there are the cross-cutting issues, agriculture and the impact on tourism and the health infrastructure. If a tourist is at risk, are all those things in place? So it was a very important thing to do, and certainly is recommended.
Thank you. Nothing to add there, but to say that we will be sort of sharing with everyone who has registered and showed up here today links to a few key documents, so that you could see in more detail some of the findings that Elecia started to articulate here in the broadest sense. But there's much more, and I'm sure if you're a destination that's interested in starting your journey in this regard, you may want to zoom in on very specific things. So a last question for Gianil here before we sort of open it up to everyone. I'm sure, with these processes, there are lots of good things that come out of the process, and we can see this. You've articulated some of these, but there are always challenges too. And I think that we always tend to focus on those things that are we tend to focus on things that are more positive than negative, but there's so much good learning from things that maybe don't go right or could be improved. And so could you share with us any sort of specific challenges that your ministry in particular encountered as you dove into this initiative? And if you could give us a sense of how you overcame these challenges as well.
It's funny that you asked that, because as Paloma spoke, I smiled, because the lessons she learned are actually some of the challenges that we experience in terms of data, the gaps, in terms of the data that we do collect as a destination. And we've been trying for years at the Ministry of Tourism level to get our colleagues responsible for statistics to broaden the scope of data collected on our behalf, not just visitor arrivals. As a matter of fact, some years ago, through the Sustainable Destination Council, which I will explain, we reached out with support from SDI, started working on 2 surveys. We did a survey in 2017 and repeated in 2021 called the Residents Perception Survey, because we collect data on visitors, but what are the perceptions? Are our residents satisfied? So we have been speaking about that, and it has shown up. It has been highlighted when we started on this initiative, the fact that we need to be collecting more data. Secondly, we had an issue in terms of collaboration. Some people term it siloism, because some people see that environmental issues should be dealt with by the Ministry of Environment. But as I said earlier, if there's no environment, there's no tourism. And it speaks to the fact that there needs to be even greater collaboration. As Elecia spoke, she talked about agriculture, she talked about health, because all of those things have an impact on tourism, and tourism impacts them. It is important that we collaborate. And so when I mentioned the Sustainable Destination Council, that was one of our responses, because that was an identified gap since 2012 of the need for there to be more collaboration for us to be a truly sustainable destination. And so we have the Sustainable Destination Council, which started in November 2013, bringing together the public sector, private sector, and civil society to act in an advisory capacity to the Ministry of Tourism on issues like these. And that is where we started, even with our participatory approach to developing the climate action plan. The SDC, as it is called, was very actively involved in terms of the workshops, the focus group meetings, and the one-on-one interviews, right? But we still see the need for there to be even greater collaboration. Sometimes I think we focus a lot on public sector, private sector collaboration when there are gaps even within government ministries in terms of their level of collaboration. And as Paloma pointed out, funding, we saw funding as an issue. Everybody, when asked, said finance is a major issue. But when we looked at it, there were opportunities for financing. The thing is, one person knew and it was not shared. And then finally, one of the other challenges we recognize is the lack of capacity in terms of the technical capacity within the destination to deal with some of the things that we need to deal with to action in terms of measurement. We do not have the capacity on the ground. And so that is something we need to work on in terms of improving the human resource capacity within the destination. So those were the major challenges that were identified, but I believe we could overcome them. We have not overcome them yet, but because they were highlighted in this exercise and because of the government's effort to become a sustainable island state, it means more attention will be given. And I'm looking forward to us being able to work on these issues as we move forward.
Wonderful. So we're seeing here some sort of structural changes that you had in place, right? Which really facilitated the development of this resilience strategy based on the work that this council that you have, this multi-sectorial council that has been established. That's another great idea for all destinations thinking about this, either through this process or prior, starting to think about, coming up with that sort of very diverse set of decision makers that can sort of help provide views from different perspectives and bring into the planning process. So I'm conscious of time here. And I want to make sure that the audience has an opportunity to ask questions of our experts here. So I'm going to turn it over to Casey to see if there are questions that have come in from the audience. And if you could help us then, Casey, to pose whatever question or two may be available from the audience. Over to you.
Ladies, first of all, I would like to thank you guys for a great conversation. It was a lot of great information, a lot of nuggets to take away. So hopefully the audience has some equally good questions. Okay. Well, the first question that's come in is, and this is a guess to all of the panelists today. How do you engage with the local community and stakeholders? I know that Danielle mentioned it in her conversation, but how would you guys suggest engaging with local community stakeholders in development and implementation of climate resilience strategies?
So as I mentioned, we have the Destination Council, but there are other areas which can use because we use the media, whether social or traditional, to engage the public. And I think that we can use that for these types of actions as well, because we have to create the awareness and we have to educate people very often. And we did little surveys when we were developing the plan and ask questions. Everybody is aware in a broad sense about climate change, but when you start to drill down, then there is a gap in terms of the information that people have. And I think the onus is on us as those who are aware to share with the public as much as we can. I know it is not one of the most sexy topics, and I can tell you this because I would have gone to the radio stations to talk about some of the issues, and I listen to other radio programs and calls keep coming in. The phones are ringing off the hook. But when we start talking about these issues, there's a dearth of calls and we have to keep talking. But the thing is, as I mentioned, it's changing attitudes. And so we have to keep at it. We can't stop. We have to keep at it until we begin to see the change.
All right, thanks a lot. We have a question in from Adriana as well. How does collaboration between international tourism organizations, Caribbean governments, and local communities shape effective tourism adaptation plans? And do you have any successful case stories? Again, this was opened up to the panel.
Elecia, do you want to discuss that maybe?
I'm gonna jump in quickly. No, I would just wanted to say though that one initiative the Climate Studies Group has been a part of is the development of the State of the Caribbean Climate Report. So that's something that we've done. It didn't hone in on sectors necessarily, but that's a space where we're serving the Caribbean. I certainly know that the Caribbean Institute of Meteorology and Hydrology produces climate service information that's useful for the sectors and so on. So I think there are initiatives underway, and even from a forum like this, I mean, you can certainly reach out to Jamaica and we can share the best practices from so there's certainly room for collaboration. I just wanted to respond very quickly to the first question Casey raised about engaging local communities. Wearing my former hat when I was serving at the Ministry of Tourism as a senior director, one of the things I know the ministry did was, certainly training with community members, reaching out to the businesses and doing business continuity planning training. We did simulation exercises if they're simulating for, earthquakes, and also my mind is tsunamis and so on. So, we've done those kinds of exercises with the sector. So engaging them so that they can be prepared and a little more resilient. And of course, the whole other, slew of things regarding electricity, using renewables and so on. So those are some things we can do at a community level, but I'll pause here.
Thanks a lot, Elecia.
Maybe
Anyone else?
Maybe, and Paloma, you may have some additional points, but to Adriana's question, which was focused on like collaboration between international tourism organizations, Caribbean governments, and then local communities. I think these two examples here are just perfect case studies of this, right? So in the case of Jamaica, the funding was regional. So it was from I think the Caribbean Development Bank and the IDB as well, among others. And then you have, the sort of commitment of government and multiple agencies here, as you heard, Elecia mentioned, multiple, government agencies involved alongside the Ministry of Tourism. And then, this sort of opens up and helps you to create that environment to bring in the community and other key stakeholders. But I think in this climate space, especially in the Caribbean, there are a multitude of potential partnerships as well with St. Kitts, right? An international nonprofit like Sustainable Travel International working as sort of a technical partner to St. Kitts in the way that UWI worked as a partner to the government in Jamaica, right? So there's so many ways to look at this. I mean, I think hopefully this conversation emphasizes the fact that radical collaboration is possible, and that the funding is there, as you heard from Paloma. With a little bit of research, there is funding out there that your destinations can access to start their journey. Paloma, anything else to add?
Just want to echo, the same thing, as an international organization, we are facilitators. We are supporting the tourism, public sector in this case, tourism ministry in developing this plan. And by integrating and collaborating with all the other sectors, so civil society, private sector, and other governmental agencies, we are creating actionable plans. So, real activities, real actions that can be done that are aligned with what everything else that is happening on the island and what they want to accomplish. So this, hopefully will be a success story because they already have the plan, and it's really a matter of, of implementing. But the approach that we've created with all of this collaboration is really make it, feasible and actionable.
Thank you so much, Paloma. And Casey, I'm looking at the clock here, so I have just a few things before we wrap up, because I know we want to send everyone off right on time at 12:30. So before we wrap, yeah, sorry.
Before we pass that over, there was one more question from Jacqueline. And this is touching on one of the points that Elecia was mentioning or directed towards, the possible impacts of overwater bungalows and encroaching of new hotels on beaches in the region. Did your study touch on any of that when you guys were doing your assessment?
Certainly, as a quick response, in the plan, we certainly suggested that they need to relook at their building practices and building away from the coastline and minimizing removal of seagrass beds and mangroves and so on. So, and they put themselves at risk, the bungalows right in the middle of the sea. That's a risky venture. So those are some recommendations coming across in the plan, the planning process, and certainly the regulations to match these things become critical.
Thanks, Elecia. I'll pass it back over to you. Any other questions, Seleni, before you wrap up?
Yeah, I think we're right at time. So I just have a few things to say before we wrap up. Thank you so much, Casey. So I'd like to thank everyone for joining us, and especially to Dianil, Elecia, and Paloma for being our experts this morning, and delighted to join this group too from GW standpoint, working on some of this work. I would like to also sort of share that there's something to look forward to as well, especially destinations in the Caribbean. GW, in partnership with the CTO and STI, will be involved in this as well. We'll be launching a climate adaptation and resilience course for coastal destinations. So this is going to be launched in the spring of 2025, and it's a very sort of practical workshop. So you get to learn sort of the latest trends, but then also to understand some of the technical aspects of these assessments. And then hopefully that can guide your destination in thinking through its efforts. So we want to keep that in mind. You'll be hearing from us. Also, please click into those links. Thank you, Alex Collins with GW, who's been kind enough to help drop all those links associated to the two case studies that we discussed here. Click into those links, but know as well that we will be circulating those links subsequently. So if you didn't get an opportunity, it's coming to for you to look at those. So we encourage you to take advantage, hopefully, of the resources that are out there. Please do reach out to our experts that joined us this morning. Thanks again to the CTO for allowing us the opportunity to present on this very important topic for the Caribbean, and wishing you all a safe and great rest of your week. Thank you so much for joining us. Bye, everyone.
And